Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're so excited to be welcoming you into one of Immigrants Rising's amazing webinar with just some incredible speakers lining up for today. We will be talking about PERM. So a PERM is a really exciting process that actually employers get to take a part of along with their employees. So we actually have a really exciting agenda lined up for today, where folks will just get an opportunity to just learn a little bit more about one of these immigration options that are available for undocumented workers in the US and employers that are thinking about sponsoring their employees. So I'll just go ahead and do an overview of today's agenda for the webinar, so you get to get a sense of like what the plan is for today's speakers. So anyway, I already did an overview, so I'll just skip over that. But we will be introducing the speakers, which are Leslie and Seung, who goes by Ellie. And then we will also do a Q&A with some of our speakers today, just to get a sense of like what it's like to go about this process of the PERM. And then also to get a sense of what it's like to be on the receiving end as well. So that's just kind of like the plan for today. We will be hearing directly from an amazing attorney called Leslie, and also someone that was able to receive the PERM and is now in the process of almost getting their citizenship. So we will be having that for today. And then also we will get an overview of one of Immigrants Rising's new resources called Getting a PERM resource. So for any of you joining in today's webinar, any of you if you've heard of PERM, and even if you haven't, I think this is going to be a really great opportunity for you to just get a exciting exposure to one of these options that are available for you. And just to clarify, PERM is not the one that like has to do with, if you go to the salon and you get a PERM, this is a whole different thing. So just to clarify. And then also we will be doing just like a Q&A, and I think I mentioned that earlier today. So anyway, I will just hand it over to Denia to just like introduce herself. And then we will just go around and just share like a little bit of just very brief introductions of today's speakers. So Denia, do you want to go ahead and just introduce yourself to the group?
Sure. Just really quickly, welcome everyone. It's really exciting to have such great turnout. There are 97 of you here with us, so thank you for joining this evening. My name is Denia Perez, pronouns she, her, ella. I'm the Legal Services Senior Manager here at Immigrants Rising, and I'm excited to be co-facilitating this panel with my amazing colleague, Jesus, who I will let introduce himself.
Thank you. Yes, and I think I get to be in a habit of just like going straight to a presentation before introducing myself. So hi, everyone. My name is Jesus. I am the Legal Services Programming Lead at Immigrants Rising. In case if you've heard of like our pre-law program, I'm actually one of the brains behind that. So yeah, and my pronouns are he, him, his. And I'll turn it over to Leslie to introduce herself. Oh, Leslie, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. I was just updating my name to say where I'm from, Pathway for Immigrant Workers. And my pronoun is she, hers. First, thank you so much for inviting me to join the panel. I'm very excited to be here and super excited about the turnout, and even more excited that someone else said that the PERM process is exciting, because I love PERM and I love doing it, but I'm one of a few group of people. So Jesus, welcome to the club. I'm an immigration attorney. I'm based out of Boston, Massachusetts. I've been practicing business immigration law for now close to 30 years. I used to work as a co-managing partner of the Boston office of WR Immigration, a California-based but national immigration law firm. And last year, I started a nonprofit called Pathway for Immigrant Workers. We are a 501c3 certified nonprofit that provides pro bono legal services to local small employers and nonprofit agencies who want to sponsor their lower wage workers for PERM cases. So this is right up my alley, and I'm super excited about being here.
Thank you, Leslie. Seung, do you briefly want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Seung, and my family immigrated when I was 11 to the US, and we became undocumented. And I was undocumented for about 20 years. And when I got my green card about 5 years ago, and DACA, 10 years before. And then I've been a nurse for about 10 years, and currently I work as a critical care response nurse, or like a rapid response nurse at Stanford.
Wow, what an incredible space. So many big brains in this space. And yeah, just appreciating both of you for just setting time for this webinar, for your time. So now that you both introduce yourselves, this presentation will be shared with folks. But yeah, you can go ahead and just read people's bios in your own time. But I think Leslie did a great job in just introducing herself and what she does and kind of like what her trajectory has been. So I'll just leave it at that. Leslie, is there anything that you want to just highlight from your bio for today's webinar?
No, let's not talk about me. Let's talk about PERM.
I love that attitude. Okay. Seung, same question goes with you. Is there anything that you haven't shared that you want to highlight in your bio?
No, I'm okay as well.
Awesome. So actually, I want to turn it over to Denia, and yeah, she'll just go ahead and get our conversation started with PERM.
Awesome. If we can go back to Leslie's bio, just while we ask her a few questions. Thank you. And again, thank you both so much for joining us. We're so excited to have Leslie and her expertise in this space so that we can all learn a little bit more about this employment-based green card. I'm going to have her beautiful picture up here while I ask her some questions that I think are already coming through the chat. So Leslie, to start us off, can you talk a little bit about how you started doing these kinds of applications and why you got into this work?
Sure. So it's a little distracting looking at a picture of yourself. I don't know about the rest of you, but there's something odd about being presenting in a Zoom setting. So I wish I was looking at an audience of faces so I could look at all of you and say, PERM is great. I've been doing business immigration law for now 30 years. And I started doing labor certs because, the managing attorney who hired me didn't like doing them. So they landed on my plate. And I think it's a fascinating process, and it makes a lot of sense, kind of testing the labor market to see if there are any qualified U.S. workers can do a job, and if not, finding foreign talent or foreign labor to come in and fill the holes. And we've been doing this, for well over a century. This most recent edition of, what I'm doing, the nonprofit Pathway for Immigrant Workers, we're particularly focused on local employers and nonprofits. And we're doing that for a reason. Back in the early 90s, anyone could do a PERM case. It works for any type of job, and anyone could pay the legal fees. But in the 90s, under the Clinton administration, they changed the rules because they were afraid of fraud and shifted it so only for the employer could pay the lawyer or any of the fees associated with the labor cert case. And maybe there was fraud, maybe there wasn't, and maybe that fixed the fraud. But what it really did was it closed the avenue for local employers, for small mom and pop shops to be able to sponsor their lower wage workers, because no small business or nonprofit has an extra $10,000 or $15,000 to, invest in a minimum wage worker. It just doesn't make economic sense for really small businesses. So, that's what brought the mission to Pathways, to open that up by offering the legal services for free.
Thank you, Leslie. The second question we have, just to sort of set up the stage, and you already mentioned it in your first answer a little bit, is this option only for certain kinds of jobs or fields? I think there's a misconception sometimes that only people in STEM or tech would be able to benefit from something like PERM. Can you give examples of fields that are in non-tech or STEM that you've worked on?
Yeah, I mean, that is a common misperception. And if there is a full-time year-round job offer, it is eligible for the PERM process. There is no educational requirement. It's not only for professional jobs. It's not only for jobs where you can't find enough, specialized U.S. workers. People have a lot of ideas that like, it's only for this certain group. I've done PERM labor certs for pizza delivery guys, right? It's full-time year-round job offer. I've done it for McDonald's counter supervisors. I've done PERM cases for, all the constructions trades. There is no requirement that there is a certain level of education or experience or specialized skills. And a question I get a lot from employers, well, a U.S. worker could do this, right? Well, that's not the standard. Is there a U.S. worker ready, willing, and able to do it? And for a lot of jobs, they are just no U.S. workers willing to take the jobs, and that's enough to prove what we need to prove to win a labor cert.
Wow, that's incredible. She said pizza delivery workers. She said anyone in construction. There's no, necessary requirement that it has to be limited to a specific field. So that's really great to know. I think another question that we're getting, Leslie, in the chat and Q&A is there a specific amount of time you have to be employed by someone in order to be considered for this? Is there a time requirement or like familiarity that's already necessary?
Yeah. And that makes sense. I mean, you would think, okay, I should be in a job for X amount of time, and what's that requirement? And that's a question I get from people a lot. The answer is no, right? The process was designed as a prospective process to establish a shortage of U.S. workers in the economy and then reach out abroad to bring people into the country so that they can do the jobs. Bricklayers laying, bridges at the turn of the century. Because there just weren't enough bricklayers in the United States. So the law is written in a prospective manner. Someone doesn't even have to be in the job today, and you could still go through the PERM process. Most people are in the jobs because, if you're not, the Department of Labor might have a question, is it a real job opportunity available if you're not doing the job and you're here? They might have fraud considerations. So, while I've done cases while someone's not particularly in the job at that moment, that's rare. But if you're in the job for a day, good enough.
That's great to hear. Thank you so much, Leslie. And I just want to acknowledge, we're not going to cover all of the ins and outs and details of this process today. This webinar is really just to get people familiar and get people curious about exploring this option, right? And so we are going to provide a general overview of the most common questions. And the great part about this particular panel is that Leslie is going to be offering her information so that if folks are interested, they can, follow up with her to do a consultation to see if this would be a good option for you. So last question before we turn it over to Jesus, Leslie, is just general advice you have for people considering pursuing this pathway, just anything that they should keep in mind, maybe ways to approach an employer or prospective employer about this.
Yeah, well, first I have to say thank you very much for the plug, and I'm very excited about sharing my website with everyone and happy to talk to anyone about this as a possibility. As a nonprofit, our mission is to get information out to as many people as possible. So I'm happy to talk to anyone who has questions. The biggest stumbling block I see in people wanting to do this is their employer's willingness to do it. So while not everyone is eligible for PERM, everyone has to go through an individual assessment to make sure that their specific factors would allow them to adjust status or consular process in the United States. Assuming the answer to that is yes, not all employers want to, go through the process. It's an employer-driven process. The employer hires the lawyer. The employer is the one filing the application and the immigrant visa petition. And, how to approach your employer and, answer their questions, I think is, a good place to start thinking about the process.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I'm going to turn it over to Jesus because now we're going to hear from someone who was able to benefit from this option.
Thank you, Danya. Yeah, so actually, this is very exciting for me to actually start this conversation with Seung. And this actually, we have a couple questions lined up since Seung is now working as a nurse. So Seung, now my questions are for you. How did you find out about PERM and that it was especially like an option for you?
Yeah, so I found out through Immigrant Rising. Back then it was before FC, and they were offering a free legal consultation. There was a law firm coming from East Coast for about a week, and I got a free consultation. And I thought I knew everything about my situation. I was undocumented, and I was feeling fairly hopeless. I didn't have a lot of options. This was before DACA, and I was still hoping for DREAM Act to pass, and I was still in college. But through the consultation, I brought some papers that my dad filed, and I realized that because my dad applied for an immigration reform back in 2001 under 245I, I'm actually grandfathered under that. So I found out that I was available, but that I probably needed work experience or advanced degree to get sponsored. So I knew that in college, and years later, they ended up helping me out after having DACA because I had the work experience. So it was really thanks to Immigrant Rising that I was able to know that option and be able to use it later.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point that you bring up, especially I think this could actually encourage folks if we have any like educators in the space or any high school students or people currently in the process of finishing up a degree. I think this could actually motivate them to pursue a career, not necessarily as a nurse, although that is highly encouraged, especially by Seung. But it is kind of like one of those motivators too, that if you don't currently have an immigration option for you right now, there are ways for you to kind of build your way towards one. And I think Seung's story is an example of that. So now I have another question for you. So what do you think people should be aware of before starting this process?
I feel like people should be aware that it's actually really stressful. And I think that probably goes without saying. Being undocumented is a stressful situation, like in general. But when you're in the process, it can take a long time. And I think it's important to understand that, like, depending on the country that you're from, this could take years, right, of waiting. So you really want to be resilient, and you really want to emphasize on self-care, knowing that this is a very stressful time in your life.
Yes. Yes. And I think we also have a question from someone. Maybe this could also be a question for you, Seung, which I think is kind of related to the first question we asked, but is how did you know, like, kind of like your path as a nurse kind of led you through the PERM path? Like, did you have to talk to like an attorney? Did you talk to a friend? What was it that kind of sparked that kind of interest in applying for PERM, or like telling your employer, hey, this is an option for me, would you sponsor me?
Well, I mean, to be really honest, that was because years ago when immigration looked kind of hopeless, so it looked like DACA was about to end. So I became scared. So actually, when I had DACA, I became very complacent because I had a good job, I had a good career, and I thought eventually I'd be legalized through a DREAM Act or some kind of a legal legislation. When that wasn't happening, I got really scared. And I knew I had this option. So I just started really searching for it because I was like, well, this DACA might end next year. I might lose my job. So that really scared me and put me into action.
I think that's a very valid point. And I think a lot of folks in the space right now, including myself, with DACA kind of being on and off, and I think still being challenged in the courts, I think that's something very valid, right? That a lot of undocumented people are thinking about, like, are there opportunities beyond DACA for folks that currently have DACA or folks that have never been able to be eligible for it? So I think that's something very valid, things to just consider. And I guess my next question for you is, well, I know this could be like a process. I think any immigration application or just like the filing of it can be very anxiety provoking. And as you mentioned, like time was of the essence. So what were some doubts or fears and questions you had about the PERM process as you were going through it?
Yeah, so it was kind of a hard process for me because as an undocumented person who had DACA, I wasn't sure how the perm process was going to be. So I guess I was afraid that because of my DACA status, that even at the very end, when everything was pre-qualified, and even at the interview, that they might discriminate because I have DACA. But it really turned out to not be an issue, and it was actually a very smooth process, including the interview. So the fact that I had DACA wasn't so much of an issue because I had 245I. So depending on your legal situation, it may not be as difficult as you think it might be, but that was a big fear for me. Also, it took me twice. I was rejected the first time because I applied with a smaller company, and the smaller company was rejected, so I had to reapply with a different company. So it just there was a lot of fear in the process, wondering if my company will be big enough or whether it's to have the legal resources. All of that was a difficult process.
Yeah, I'm sure it sounds very difficult, but at the same time, I'm glad you were asking the right questions. It sounds like you also went to the right people. I also acknowledge that, like, in a way, you're also outing yourself to spaces you don't necessarily know if it'll be like safe for you, or what if like the worst thing they can do is say no. But then at the same time, you are saying that you're undocumented, right? And you mentioned that you have DACA. So I'm glad that like that process went smoothly for you, and hopefully that process can also reflect in other people's experiences too. So my next question for you, Seung, is what advice would you give people right now in this space that are considering approaching their employers about sponsoring them?
Yeah, so I would encourage them to be persistent. So I had to ask twice. So when I first asked Stanford, because of the management or HR, I'm not sure exactly what, but I remember talking to upper management and they actually said no. So they weren't willing to sponsor me. So I actually ended up working two jobs because I didn't want to lose my job at Stanford. I worked for a small travel nursing company, and that company was too small to get sponsored, but the legal law firm that I use actually recommended them. So they have success before, but for whatever reason, I got rejected using them. And they weren't paying as much. So I was working two full-time jobs. I was super stressed. And it was almost a year later that I went back to Stanford when I had a little bit of different position, a different job. I asked the management again. And this time they actually said yes, because partially because the upper management changed. But yeah, I think persistent pays off. You don't, you want to be nice about it, but you want to be persistent. And asking twice actually helped me. And that's how I got my green card. And depending on your HR, they may or may not be familiar with it. Our HR, certain parts of HR was familiar with that, but for my nursing HR, not a whole lot of nurses. There's a few of us, but there's not too many of us that get sponsored, especially at Stanford. So they weren't really familiar with this. So talking to HR was a little bit slower and frustrating, but I just had to be very persistent through the whole process. So I think that's something I want people to really have the mindset of resilience and persistence.
I think that's a really great point. And I actually have a follow-up question to that I'm sure a lot of people are asking themselves. I'm asking this myself. Like, how did you go about asking them? Is it like, did you get it from like a template? Did your attorney, like folks that you were just talking with, did they say, this is how you should ask? Did it happen in your like hiring process, or was it after you were hired? Sorry, I'm just already throwing in a
Actually,
lot
the
of...
hiring process, especially for nursing, a lot of the job applications will ask you if you need sponsorship, and they'll discriminate on that basis. So you actually don't want to let them know. So you actually need to be a really good worker, that someone your manager really likes, someone with a high skill set. And then you want to talk to your manager and say, hey, like, I've been here for so many years, and I actually need sponsorship. Is this something you guys can do? So I talked to my manager first, who brought it up to their upper management, the director of nursing, and then they had talked to HR. So it was a whole process, and then they get to decide whether or not they want to go forward with it.
That's really helpful. So I hope that folks listening here today, that helps them decide, regardless of what industry you are in. Hopefully that could also give you some clarity into, how to go about even just requesting it. I know a lot of folks, especially of immigrant or undocumented backgrounds, have trouble, especially just bringing up issues of like, hey, I want to like get sponsorship, or just any sort of like asking of something, right? So I hope that at least that answer was helpful for you. Leslie, is there anything, I know I'm just asking some these questions, but Leslie, is there anything you want to add to that piece,
Oh,
especially
I've
on
got
the
so
other
much to
end?
go. So I'm like, how much time are you going to give me? First, as an immigration attorney, I'm so sorry that people are stressed, right? Like I know it, if you're not sure your immigration status is stable, it's stressful, but the PERM process should not be stressful. The PERM process is one of the it's a long process. It's full of pitfalls. You have to do things exactly right or it's denied and there's no coming back from that. So that's scary, but it's really not because it's really clear what you're supposed to do. So I tell people it's like a quantitative analysis. It's like if you do all these right things, it will be approved. It's not like a lot of other things in immigration where they're evaluating you personally. It's just, did you place the ad right? Did you do the recruitment like you were supposed to? Did anyone apply? No, then you're going to win.
Very nice. And I very quickly, we still have a couple more minutes for this section, but how long is the process? First with Seung, how long was your process? And then maybe we can hear from Leslie, like as a legal practitioner, just in your experience. But first, Seung, how long was your process?
It took about a year applying with my first company, and I got rejected within the year. And then I thought about applying with them again, but I waited and tried to wait for Stanford, and then Stanford sponsored me, and that happened within the year as well. I think it was about 10 months, if I remember correctly. But it was really fast for me because there's no wait list for Korea. So it depends on the country you're from, how long some of the wait lists can be. So that was short. And then our company, Stanford had their own lawyers. So I didn't have to pay for my own lawyer like the other company. So that helped a lot as well because the legal team at Stanford was pretty familiar with the process. So it became a lot faster.
Thank you, Seung. Leslie, is there anything you want to add to just kind of like as a legal practitioner, what kind of time frame have you seen from some of the clients that you've worked with or from other folks that you've seen in the community?
Yeah, we always tell people in the beginning, we're working with 3 different government agencies and 2 processes in one government agency. So processing times can and do change, and they often get longer. Right now, for the labor certification process, the PERM process, between the prevailing wage, the recruitment, and then the actual adjudication of the PERM, you can easily get up to close to 2 years. The I-140 process with USCIS can be premium process. So if you pay the extra fee of $1,410, it can take, that the processing will take 2 weeks, but there's putting the case together. So there's going to be a couple of months there. And then if you adjust status here in the United States, it's going to be district by district. On the East Coast, on Boston, it takes about 11 months. I don't know what it is in other coasts, but I saw a question, do I work with people outside of Massachusetts? The answer is yes. Anywhere in the country, if immigration law is federal law, it works the same in every state. And then if you consular process, that depends on the country's backlogs. So, start by thinking at least a couple of years. And if you're still doing this 4 years later, you're not alone. And that's not even talking about the country backlogs. So, every case is different, but it's a long process.
Thank you, Leslie. That actually was very helpful. And for folks that are listening in this webinar, if this all sounds like gibberish, if you just don't really understand anything that's being spoken, or if you're like me and you prefer to read stuff, I think you process better over reading. We actually had someone that linked our resource, and we're going to be sharing that a little bit later today in this webinar. But we actually have a resource where we wrote down a lot of this information that Leslie and Seung was sharing about their experience, and actually addresses a lot of these questions that are being asked in the Q&A and in the chat, which we love the engagement, by the way. But yes, we actually have a resource that we'll be going over that you all can utilize, and you can share it with your networks. So that actually makes me transition to the next piece, which is just giving an overview about this new resource that Immigrants Rising has. And Denia, I think now I'm just going to turn it over to you so you can go ahead and just start with the overview. But thank you both, Seung and Leslie, just in sharing some of your answers to my questions.
Yes, thank you both for sharing that. And Jesus, feel free to move to the next slide. So a lot of you beat us to the punch. So part of this webinar was to also unveil this new resource that we put together in partnership with both Leslie and Dan Berger, who's another incredible partner and immigration attorney who has a lot of experience doing not only PERMs, but other employment-based visas. So the purpose of this resource is just, again, to give a broad overview. Like many and all of our resources, our goal is to really try to break down these really big concepts, these really big processes in a very digestible way. So it's not going to include the answer to every single one of your questions, but it is going to give you a big picture idea of what this is, how it works, who can apply, what the timeline is. And again, the hope is to provide this initial overview so that you have enough information to then potentially bring this conversation to your employer and get a consultation. As with any immigration option, every case is different. Every person's immigration history is very different. So you really need a full consultation to understand the specifics for your particular case. But this not guide, it's a 2-pager, really is just meant to give you a snapshot view of what PERM is. So as we've talked about, it is short for Program Electronic Review Management, also known as labor certification. It is the most common green card category used by employers to sponsor an employee for permanent residence or for their green card. Through this process, anyone, regardless of the field that they're in or like education level, as Leslie mentioned, she's done these for pizza delivery workers. You don't need to have a specialty of any kind. You just need to be able to meet these different steps, could be potentially eligible for this. So who can apply? Again, any employer can sponsor any employee for permanent residence. The process is done for jobs, again, that range from dishwasher to doctor. There's a huge range in between that, right? No labor is unskilled labor. This is just about labor and getting people to be able to work legally for their employers here in the US. So again, very quickly, most jobs require a PERM application. There are some exceptions, including for nurses, physical therapists, or people of exceptional ability. But overall, anyone theoretically can potentially qualify for this so long as they meet other requirements. So what are the eligibility requirements? The position must be full-time and permanent has a very specific legal definition, which is it's lasting more than a year with no fixed date. So again, going back to the fraud piece Leslie was talking about, the government is always concerned about preventing fraud. And so in this context, it's really to make sure that people are going to be in that job for at least a year, right? Like you can't force someone to stay in a job forever, but permanent, it has to be, at least a year. So the next slide, please, Jesus. So now that we know what it is, who it's for, a lot of questions that we're getting in Q&A and in the chat are specific about how long the process takes. As Seung mentioned, depending on your country of nationality, like it could range, right? It also, depending on how complicated your particular case is, it could really depend and take a few years. But in general, it takes 2 to 3 years from the moment you file the labor certification to the time you actually are able to get your green card. And as we indicate here, unfortunately, like with many of the visa backlogs, if you come from countries like India or China, the wait might be a little bit longer just because, there are these caps and like wait times for countries that send a lot of immigrants here to the US. Again, the cost will vary depending on whether you hire a private attorney or are able to get free assistance or, sliding scale assistant, but the range is anywhere from $2,500, which is just the forms, the advertising fees, screenings, to $20,000. Again, that's a huge range, again, because depending on how much your attorney charges, whether or not you can get the initial legal work done for free, it could really range. So this is a big range. And it's also why, it's important to work with an employer who would be able to front these costs. Legally, actually, the employer is required to pay for all fees related to the Department of Labor process, which is the initial, advertising, doing the labor certification. But the immigration piece, which, is the one that leads to the green card, the I-140, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Leslie, the employer is not necessarily required to pay for those fees, just the labor ones.
You're correct. So the employer is only on the hook for paying all fees associated with the first step, the PERM process.
And we have this graphic here, as Jesus said, to help folks maybe who are a little bit more visual. So this electronic labor certification piece, which is where the employers are paying to sort of advertise the position, to ask the Department of Labor to certify that they are paying the prevailing wage and there isn't anyone to fill these positions. That's the first step. Once that gets approved, then it's the immigration piece. So you file an I-140, which is the name of the form that you file with immigration to then be on the pathway to a green card. And we have a lot of questions about, well, is this only for DACA people? Like, what if you came without a legal entry? Are you still eligible? All great questions, and it depends, right? Again, it's not necessarily only for people with DACA. Depending on how long a person has had DACA, it can make the process easier for them if they haven't accrued what's called unlawful presence, but it's not impossible. It just means that for your particular case, if you don't have DACA, or if you did not come in lawfully or don't have 245I, for example, there might be some other steps that you need to take in order to get to your green card, but it's not only for people with DACA. It just means people who may have had DACA since they were 18 might have a little bit of an easier time because they haven't accrued what's called unlawful presence.
Thank you, Denia. And speaking of steps, we're running out of time for this section. So I'm just going to go ahead and go to the next slide. But yeah, these are kind of just as in this resource, we even provided an overview of just some of the steps that Denia and Leslie and Seung also mentioned through their responses in this webinar. So we're not going to go into detail, but hopefully you all can just review it in your own time. These are just kind of like breaking down these different steps that both employers and employees and the attorney get to do to get you to that pathway towards a green card. So again, I'm not going to go over these steps since I think that most of them were already mentioned, but you can always review them in your own time. We've shared the link. Denia, if you can just share the link again, because I think it might be buried under so much great engagement from our community here today. But yeah, and where we actually included also some links that you can also look up, but just very briefly, some of the resources that you can also go to for just support in getting help with applying for PERM is the AILAlawyer.com. So this is the American Immigration Lawyers Association, Coran Berger and Colt Immigration Law, and then Pathway for Immigrant Workers. So very great resources. And this is just a start, right? So AILA lawyers, you can also include your zip code. So if you're from, like, again, as Leslie mentioned, immigration law is federal law. So you could, you can access lawyers from any state, but just make sure that they're also specialized in this section. But yeah, AILA lawyer, you can just put in your zip code. So if you're from like Florida, or if you're from like a rural part of like your state, you can also see which lawyer is closest to you. Again, Leslie's here. You can also ask her more questions. You can follow up with her, maybe get an initial consultation. But yeah, and then where, again, I included some, in case you're interested in learning more about this resource, you can access Pathway for Immigrant Workers, also just some other great immigration law firms, or also Immigrants Rising. This resource, you can always look it up, read it through in your own time, or also you can share this resource with your manager or your supervisor in case they also have additional questions about what are the steps, what is PERM, right? So I think that could also start the conversation. But now I will go again and just transition over to a Q&A. So we want to make sure that we are also addressing all of your questions and have time for just questions and answers. So the next part of this section of our webinar will just be focused on just addressing those questions. So yeah, Denia, do you have like a way of just starting our Q&A?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a few, just want to know, a lot of people are asking about Leslie's contact. Again, that is here. You can schedule a consultation with her. Her website is also linked in our resource. And then if you have any questions about our resource, the one pager that we just, or two pagers technically, that is here at legal intake at immigrantsrising.org. So I'm just going to go through the chat and we can answer some of these live. I think there's a lot of overlap. So a lot of questions right now are about how PERM might be different from an H-1 visa. So Leslie, if you want to talk maybe about some of the overlaps and differences between those two.
And I just figured out how to answer questions in the chat. So you're pulling me away. So H-1B is a non-immigrant worker. Non-immigrant is, for any amount of time, but it's not a green card. It's not permanent. An H-1B is the most common professional non-immigrant process. It gets confused with the PERM process, which is for a green card, an immigrant visa, because the PERM process is based on a labor certification, which an LC, which is a test of the labor market, and an H-1B underneath it has the requirement of having a certified LCA, a labor certification LCA, a labor certification. I'm screwing up the initials now that I'm saying it live. But they use similar terminology, so they get confused a lot. But H-1Bs are non-immigrant workers. PERM is for the permanent process. Labor condition application. There we go.
Thank you. So again, the big difference is like this kind of PERM employer-sponsored visa is really like directly for a green card. Like you can have an intent to immigrate, whereas the H-1B is a non-immigrant visa, right, Leslie? That's the biggest distinction.
Yes.
Awesome. So questions that people have. So someone said, if I own my own business and I'm undocumented, can I sponsor myself? Like, I think a lot of people are wondering if they have their own LLC, like, is that sort of like a way for them to be able to be their own boss and do this for themselves?
So if that's for me, the answer is no. The labor certification's for an employee, and if you're the owner, you're not an employee. It's even hard for people who are employees who have ownership interests in companies to do a labor cert, because if you have an ownership interest, would they really fire you? So it really has to be for an employee for a job that a U.S. worker could possibly fill.
Thank you. A lot of questions again about like whether or not a legal entry or DACA is required. Is that a requirement or for this process? I think we answered that a little bit, but Leslie, if you want to further elaborate on whether or not or how that impacts this process.
Yeah, no, and that's kind of, you start at the end, like at the end of the process when the PERM's approved and the immigrant visa is approved, can the foreign national put on the green card? And one could do that in one of two ways. Either consular processing by leaving the country and completing the process at the consulate in their home country or a third country, and that's available for people who haven't triggered bars like the 3 and 10-year bar of unlawful presence that would bar them from coming back. For people who are inside the country, who are in status, who have been inspected or paroled and admitted to the United States, they may be eligible for adjustment, but not everyone is. And that's usually the biggest barrier to this process is, at the end, can the foreign national, put the green card on?
Thank you, Leslie. And just to, again, elaborate on that. So we highlighted the steps in that graphic, right? There's the labor certification process, and then there's the I-140, which is the application you send to immigration. So that's where whether or not you have a lawful entry, whether or not, you have something called 245I, that helps you be able to adjust without having a waiver to get rid of that unlawful presence comes in handy, and where my general spiel about, every case is very different. So it's really important for you to get a consultation to understand how this can impact you specifically comes into play. So if you haven't, again, Leslie's contact information is here. She has this nonprofit she started specifically to help smaller businesses and nonprofits potentially sponsor their employees through PERM to get that process started. You can contact her to set up a consultation to see if this would be a good option for you. And if you want like a general screening, we also have an immigration legal intake service where we do a full immigration screening and do oftentimes refer people to Leslie or Dan if they are eligible for an employment-based option. So all these questions about, do I need DACA? Like, what if I came in unlawfully? Like, those are good questions like for you to ask in the screening, because that will impact just how long the process will take and any other waivers you might have to apply for the unlawful presence. So I answered that. So one specifically for Seung, you mentioned you were grandfathered in by your father. Can you speak more about that? I think that's to 245I. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, Seung. I think someone else also asked, how do you know if you're 245I? So how did you know, Seung, that you were 245I eligible?
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of like an ancient thing nowadays. So your parents had to have been there before 2001 and have applied for the immigration reform. So you really have to ask your parents if they apply for it. And if my dad actually got denied, but because we had the paperwork proving that he applied, I was grandfathered because my dad applied at that time. So you just need proof that your parents applied for it. So you can ask your parents to see if they applied for it. That for me, that was the only pathway. So.
Thank you, Seung. And sorry.
Sorry, yeah. Do you guys still do the legal consultation at Immigrant Rising, right?
We do the screenings, yes.
The legal. Yeah, I feel like that's a good thing to encourage there.
Yeah, and just to further elaborate, so if you have like an immigration application before, I think it's April 30 of 2001, and actually, like my parents were also grandfathered under the 245I. So it's any immigration application. I don't think it's only just the one that like was talked about, but I think it's, I don't know, Denny, if you want to mention this since you're like an immigration lawyer, but my understanding is that it's any immigration application that was filed through USCIS, the US Citizenship and Immigration Services.
Yes. And one thing you can do, maybe your parents forgot or they're not sure, you can file what's called a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request with USCIS, where basically you're just requesting any and all information that USCIS might have of any like applications that may have been filed or interaction that you have had with USCIS services. So that's another way to find out if maybe there was an application filed at some point, is your relative or you file a FOIA on behalf of your relative to see if an application was filed before that deadline.
Right, it's USCIS or the Department of Labor, and even if the case was denied, if it was filed before those dates, it's important. It's so exciting to see so many people actually were able to take advantage of 245I. They're relatively rare.
Yes. And it's also not only 245I, there's also 245A. But if you're curious about this terminology, Immigrants Rising also does a great job in like explaining each of these if they really apply to you. So you can also get an immigration screening through our own organization that was also mentioned. So again, go through our website under services. There's the Immigration Legal Intake Service. And if you're just curious about seeing if you have like an employment sponsorship as a potential immigration option, we can also give you a little bit more detailed information about 245A, 245I, and so on.
We have questions too about different fields, but maybe Leslie, if you want to drive that point home, that like this is not specific to any particular field, that really anyone in theory can apply for this so long as they have a willing employer who's able to go through the process. I think, we've had questions about, can educators do this, faculty, engineers? So Leslie, if you just want to, again, give some examples of different kinds of workers that you've helped file these.
Sure. And I think it's kind of interesting. What's fascinating is we can say it, but once people have a mindset, it's really hard to shift it. But I've given up on Congress, doing any kind of immigration relief. So we all have to start really doing our jobs about using the existing tools to the greatest potential that they can. So as many people who can adjust through PERM or consular process through PERM should, and it's any job, full-time year-round. I am doing a PERM case right now for a nanny, for a truck driver, for an architect, for a kitchen cook. I could pull up my docket list and keep on going, but literally it is, there are other things that need to be screened. Can the foreign national adjust or consular process? Is the employer paying the prevailing wage? Is the employer willing to do it? But any job that is full-time and year-round should talk to someone about, maybe this is the solution, because it would be great to solve as many of these immigration cases as we can with the laws that we have.
Thank you, Leslie. And yes, I know it's hard to believe because we've been conditioned like, oh, you need a fancy degree, you need no, like this is for any full-time position. Though that was a great range of examples. So thank you, Leslie. Another question we have around this process is whether someone gets a work permit in the meantime while they're waiting for this application to be processed.
Yeah.
What sort of
a great question.
Yeah.
Everyone's like, and I speak to many people, I'm here and I want to do it. But, the PERM process gives you nothing except for a green card at the end, right? It doesn't give you permission to stay in the United States while it's going through, even though it takes years. It doesn't give you work permission, if your existing, status expires, even though the process takes years. The only thing the Labor Cert PERM process will give you is the opportunity to apply for a green card at the end.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's good to know because I think a lot of people, especially if they are already employed, but they, we're all nervous about this litigation around DACA, and if folks lose their work authorization, I think that is, the curiosity is, what do we do in the meantime? Let's say you do have an employer who's willing to start this process. As we saw, it takes 2 to 3 years. So if someone doesn't have a work permit in the meantime, they just have to wait it out, or maybe do other work as consultants while they're waiting for the green card.
I'm sorry, I was answering a question.
It's okay. Yeah, I think the heart of the question is just, there's a lot of anxiety around DACA ending with this litigation. And so assuming someone does have a willing employer to start this process, if they lose their work authorization while this process is ongoing, do they just have to wait and not work legally until they get their green card?
Yes, is the answer. If you don't have work authorization, your employer should not want to keep you on payroll. The PERM process can continue, right? That doesn't affect the PERM process, but the PERM process is a representation of the employer, and any lawyer is going to advise the employer. You can't knowingly hire a foreign national without work authorization. Yeah, I'm trying to think of something positive to say at the end here, but I'm coming up blank because the courts are scaring me.
Yes, those courts are scary, and it's real. So that's why we want to get this information out there, understanding that it's a 2 to 3 year process and that it takes time, making sure people know about this sooner, to have these conversations sooner rather than later. Another question that we are getting in the chat is just whether family relationships matter. So the example someone gave is if a US citizen sibling owns a business and, has a DACA sibling on payroll, or they want to sponsor their DACA sibling, will that raise any red flags? Can family members sponsor family members if they own the business?
What a great question. You've got a good audience. Yes. It's not that you can't do it, but the Department of Labor is looking for fraud. So one of the questions on the PERM application on the 9089 is there a familiar relationship between the employer and the employee? And if there's any kind of relationship there, then the answer has to be yes. And then they look at it more carefully, which means it gets delayed. So whatever time frame we're talking about, add more time to that. But it doesn't exempt someone from doing it. I mean, we all know that if you have a small business and you need workers, and your family needs a job, you're going to hire a family member. So I've done, a cashier at a family-owned furniture store, and the mother was the cashier. And we got looked at, but it was a real and operating business, and we just had to prove it. It took a little longer, and it works. So it's not a disqualifier, but it does make the process a little longer and a little harder.
Thank you, Leslie. I hope that was helpful. And for folks who are asking, so we will be posting this webinar on our website on this same page where we have our resource. A lot of people are asking about materials. Really, it's the one pager and the conversation that's happening here, and that's being recorded. So that will definitely be posted on our website within the next few days after we are done having this great conversation. We're doing so well on time, and thank you all again for your questions. A lot of folks, again, are asking about whether the size of the company affects cases. Like, does it matter if it's a big company, a small company?
Yeah, I mean, I shook my head. No, there is no legal requirement for size of company, but there is the requirement that the employer has the ability to pay what the state determines to be the prevailing wage, kind of the fair market rate, which sometimes is reflective of reality, and sometimes it's just kind of the way they do the survey. It doesn't come out right, but the employer has to be able to pay that. So if they haven't been, or if they're super small, that can cause some issues there. But that's something that the attorney would screen in the beginning. There is no requirement that it's anything but, an employer and an employee. I'm doing a nanny who's working for a household. But, we're going to be doing lots of documenting of that.
Thank you, Leslie. We have a question about, maybe this is on the DOL website, but how much an employer needs to be paying. I think the market rates that you were talking about, and just the wages, how those are calculated. I think that's a question about.
That's a fun question. So someone could drop in I don't know how to get the chat to everybody, but the website's www.flcdatacenter.com. And that's the federal department's prevailing wage database. And every year they run the survey, and they supposedly survey every job in the U.S. economy, and they dump it in big buckets and divide it into 4 levels, and they publish it. When I want a prevailing wage for a PERM case, I file a request, and 7, 8, 9 months later, I get it back. But we could pull up the website now, and we could do it in 5 minutes because all the information's right there. So it's good to kind of poke around in there, and you can do a quick wizard search. You can, go to the region and the job title, and you can pull up the wages. It works really well for, nurse and, engineer and preschool teacher, because those are very clear job titles. So it quickly gets you to the right wage. If you're a consultant, that's a little, less defined, and it's harder to kind of figure out which one it is. Oh, look at that. Look at what you did. So, again, I tell people, sometimes it's connected to reality and sometimes it's not, but you go ahead and click on that, wage search wizard right up there on the top of the page there, and that will walk you through the process. I'm so excited about this. I'm going to move away the Q&As so I can see. Yeah, let's look for an Alabama, or how about a California? You guys are in California. Let's see what a nurse should make. And if you put in nurse under the keyword, assuming that this nurse works in Alameda County, you're going to come up with, all the different categories of nurses. And then you just pick one and you view the wages.
Nurse. They make a lot of money.
Go to view wages under any of the pieces. It's the
right here.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. And those are the 4 levels of wages for that particular. So if you're a vet tech, you should be expecting to make in the San Francisco area anywhere between, a little under 19 an hour to a little over 28 hour. And just to, let everyone know what the Department of Labor thinks, very few people are ever level 1. It's for interns and people who have just started jobs, and very few people are at level 4. Those are the very senior people in a field. Most prevailing wages will fall into level wage 1 or 2 or 3. And then which one that is dependent on 7 factors that you would then have to, the lawyer would analyze and tell you whether, which one they think you're going to land in. And then you file it with the Department of Labor and you wait. But it has all sorts of great information about, like how many years of experience are typical, what's the type of degree that is typical. So that's the fact that this is public and anyone can play around this, you kind of like you can do the whole PERM case in the beginning, and then you go through the process and wait for things to come back to you.
Awesome.
Thank you, Jesus, for pulling that up. And thank you all for your questions. I want to be respectful of time, especially for those who are maybe joining us from outside of California. But thank you all. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Seung. Thank you, Jesus. This was such a great, rich conversation. And again, hopefully just the start. There's so much information and so many great next steps that hopefully you all can make progress on after this initial conversation.
So I have to say that Jesus just proved he was a PERM nerd, because he just pulled that wage data right up. Thank you very much for having me. It was great to speak to everyone, and I'm looking forward to talking to hopefully many of you later.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.